A familiar flight over Deer Harbor, Washington, a witness camera already rolling, and a Beech A45 that looked, for one brief moment, like it still might recover. But on June 7th, 2024, that flight ended in the water. Now the question is not just what we see on the video. The real question is why an airplane that appeared to be coming back toward level flight still ran out of room. So in this breakdown, we are going through the witness video, the witness statements, the NTSB video study, and the wreckage examination to understand what happened in those final seconds. That video looks simple at first, but it is not. The airplane is moving through a smooth arc. It starts coming back toward level flight, and for a moment, it looks like there may still be a chance. Before we judge what we just saw, we need to rewind a little. This was not a random pass over the water. People on the shore knew this airplane, and some of them were already watching before the maneuver began. Before we judge the video, we need to go back to what was happening before those final seconds. This was not a random airplane passing over the water. According to the NTSB documents, the pilot was flying a familiar route around the San Juan Islands, near the Orcas Island area, close to a place where he used to live. People on shore had seen this airplane before. Similar flybys had happened in that area, and witnesses knew the sound and the movement of the airplane when it passed by. At first, this could have looked like another familiar pass, but one witness said the left wing began to drop. Another described the motion as smooth, almost like something from an air show. And then the airplane kept descending toward the water. That is why the witness statements matter. They show how the flight changed from a familiar flyby into something very different, just before the camera captured the final seconds. Before the investigation gets into measurements and wreckage, there is one piece we have to put in order first: the witness accounts. These are not guesses. These are the statements investigators collected from people who were watching from shore. They help establish the sequence before the final seconds, how the airplane appeared, how its movement changed, and when the situation stopped looking normal. So in this part, we stay with the witness statements and build the timeline from what they told investigators. The first witness account gives us a clear sequence before the final seconds. The pilot's wife had sent a message saying he was going flying and wanted them to watch for him. At first, the airplane passed along the shoreline over the water in front of the house. Then it flew out of view. The witness could still hear it, but could not see it as it turned. When the airplane came back into view, it was over the water again, on a southbound heading, and the witness said it was higher than usual. That detail matters because, at first, this still may have looked like part of a familiar routine. After it passed by, the witness saw the left wing drop. At first, she thought that was part of what the pilot normally did during these flybys. But then the wing kept dropping. The airplane began to turn, and the descent became much steeper. Someone nearby started calling, "Pull up!" But by then, the situation had already changed. This is why the witness account is important. It gives us the sequence before the camera's final seconds: a familiar pass, a change in movement, and then a rapid descent toward the water. Now we have the witness sequence. But the next question is more precise. What was the airplane actually doing in those final seconds? For that, investigators used the video study. They did not just describe the footage, they measured the movement, frame by frame, and used it to estimate the airplane's path over the water. That is where the investigation becomes much more technical. The video study is where investigators stop treating the clip as just footage and start using it as evidence. At first, a video like this can be misleading. Our eyes follow the airplane, but we do not always understand the space around it. It may look, for a moment, like the airplane is starting to come out of the maneuver. But the NTSB video study looked past that first impression. Investigators studied the airplane's movement frame by frame. They used fixed background features and the shoreline to estimate the airplane's path over the water. And that path is important. The airplane was not simply dropping straight down. The estimated path showed a smooth descending arc, consistent with the early part of an aerobatic maneuver, similar to a split S. The study estimated that the maneuver began about 1,800 feet above the water, but the projected lowest point of that path was about 30 feet below the water surface. That is the key detail. Even if the airplane looked like it was beginning to recover, the path still needed more altitude than was available. So this video study does not just show what the airplane looked like in the final seconds. It helps explain the geometry of the maneuver, the arc, the descent, and the lack of vertical space left before the water. And that is why these few seconds of footage became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation. Here is the part that matters most. This was not just about the airplane being low. It was about the shape of the path. Once the airplane entered that arc, it still needed space below it to complete the recovery, but the graph shows there was no space left. The projected path went below the waterline, and that is why altitude becomes the key issue here. That changes how we read the final seconds. When people watch the video, the airplane may look like it is starting to come back toward level flight. But attitude and flight path are not the same thing. The nose can begin to move, the wings can start to come around, and the airplane can still be traveling downward through the arc. That is the important part of the NTSB video study. It was not only looking at what the airplane looked like, it was looking at where the airplane was going. And the estimated path showed that the airplane needed more vertical space than it had. The water was already inside the path of the maneuver. So the question now becomes even more important. Was this only a low altitude maneuver problem, or was something else also affecting the airplane? To answer that, investigators had to look beyond the video and examine the airplane itself. So the key point is this: the video can make the final seconds look almost recoverable, but the measured path tells a different story. The airplane still needed more space below it than it had. And that leads to the next question. Was this only about altitude and maneuver geometry, or did investigators find something wrong with the airplane itself? To answer that question, investigators had to examine what was recovered from the airplane. The wreckage was taken to Avtech Aviation in Auburn, Washington, where the airframe and engine were inspected. The damage was severe, and not every part of the airplane was recovered from the water. The canopy, the nose wheel assembly, the engine cowling, and part of the right wing were not found during the search. Saltwater also affected the wreckage, which made the examination harder, but investigators were still able to check the major systems. They established flight control continuity for the rudder, elevator, and aileron systems through damaged and fracture-separated parts. The flaps were found retracted, the landing gear handles were found in the up position, and the landing gear actuator was also in the retracted position. Then, investigators looked at the engine. The engine had separated from the airframe, but it was largely intact. The report noted no evidence of a crankcase or oil sump breach. The oil screen was clear, the oil pump gears were intact, the fuel injection nozzles were clear, the spark plugs showed wear signatures consistent with normal operation, and inside the engine, investigators did not find evidence of catastrophic internal damage. So the examination did not point to an obvious engine failure or a broken flight control system that would explain the final descent. That matters because it keeps the focus on the path of the maneuver, the altitude available, and what the airplane was doing in the final seconds. So the wreckage examination did not give investigators a simple mechanical answer. The airplane was badly damaged, and some parts were missing from the recovery. But the systems they could check did not point to a major engine failure or a broken flight control system. So the investigation comes back to the same question. Why was the airplane in that part of the sky, at that altitude, trying to complete that path? With no clear mechanical failure identified, the investigation turned back to the pilot and the flight itself. And this is the difficult part of the story, because the pilot was not inexperienced. He had an extraordinary aviation background, thousands of hours of flight time, and deep familiarity with this type of airplane. The NTSB report describes a pilot with a long history of high standards and conservative flying habits. But the report also noted that, as he aged, some of those standards may have become less rigid. He had stopped flying aerobatics at air shows years earlier. He had also moved away from higher performance airplanes and shifted towards simpler, seasonal flying in this airplane type. The report said he had made 23 flights in the year before the accident, but had also taken a long break from flying between November and the end of May. So this was not a case of someone who did not know aviation. It was a case where experience, familiarity, and confidence may have met a maneuver that required more altitude than was available. This is the hard part of the investigation. The pilot had the experience. The airplane did not show an obvious mechanical failure. And the video study showed a path that needed more altitude than was available. So the report starts to narrow the picture, not to one dramatic failure, but to a decision made before the final seconds ever appeared on camera. Before we get to the final NTSB finding, we need to be clear about what the report did not find. At this point, the report becomes important not only for what it says, but for what it does not support. The examination did not find evidence of a pre-accident malfunction in the airframe or engine. The video also indicated that the engine was operating during the descent and appeared to be producing power at impact. Investigators also looked at the pilot's medical profile. The report noted medical conditions typical for his age, including moderate coronary artery disease, but it did not identify evidence that a sudden medical event caused the accident. The maneuver was coordinated enough to indicate that the pilot was still actively controlling the airplane. So the report was not pointing toward a sudden engine failure, a broken flight control system, or a clear medical incapacitation. It was narrowing toward something else, a low-altitude maneuver with too little vertical margin. At this point, the investigation has narrowed. The report did not point to a clear engine failure. It did not point to a broken flight control system. And it did not point to medical incapacitation as the cause. So now we are left with the part that is hardest to say plainly: the airplane's path, the altitude available, and the decision to begin that maneuver where it began. Now we can look at the final NTSB finding. The NTSB final finding brings all of those pieces together. The agency determined that the probable cause was the pilot's decision to perform an aerobatic maneuver at low level, and his misjudged entry altitude for that maneuver, which resulted in impact with water. In plain terms, the report was not pointing to a sudden engine failure, a broken control system, or a clear medical incapacitation. It was pointing to the maneuver itself. The video study showed the shape of the path. The wreckage examination did not identify a pre-accident mechanical failure, and the final report concluded that the maneuver began too low for the altitude that was actually available. That is why the aircraft could appear, for a moment, to be recovering, but still run out of vertical space before the water. That is the final finding from the NTSB. A familiar flyby, a maneuver started too low, and a flight path that simply did not leave enough room above the water. Now, I want to hear your view. After seeing the witness statements, the video study, and the wreckage examination, what part of this accident stands out to you the most? Was it the altitude, the decision to start the maneuver, or the way the final seconds looked on video? Write your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more breakdowns based on official reports, witness evidence, and real investigation documents, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.